Wicked cool. Feature alert.
Hey there, podcast fans. Thanks for listening. Now, you can also reach out and send me a text message. On every episode, at the top of the show notes, you'll see a link that says, send us a text message. Simply click it, write something super nice and sweet, and away we go. Also remember to please subscribe, share this podcast with a friend by telling them about it, and leave us a positive review, whether it's on Apple, Spotify, your favorite podcast streaming service, or even on our website at www.afraidofnothingpodcast.com.
From the President's office in the White House in Washington, D.C., we present an address by the President of the United States, Dwight D. Eisenhower.
My fellow citizens, my subject tonight is science in national security. I am going to lay the facts before you, the rough with the smooth. Some of these security facts are reassuring. Others are not. They are sternly demanding.
Never wish someone wrote about something mysterious and interesting, but there was no book about it. Tonight's guest, author and investigative reporter Paul Blake Smith, is just like you. For years, decades even, Paul waited for a book to be written about an alleged extraterrestrial crash on a farm outside of his hometown of Cape Girardeau, Missouri. No one did. So Paul meticulously researched and wrote the book himself. Paul also had a curiosity about President Eisenhower's rumored meeting with aliens. A few articles were written, but nothing substantial to satisfy Paul's curiosity. So he wrote that book too. Tonight, Paul reveals his findings, included in his two books, MO41, The Bombshell Before Roswell, and President Eisenhower's Close Encounters.
Sound effect music from Zapsplat.com.
In a world where nothing is known, nothing is certain, reality is not real. Wake up! Be afraid of nothing. I'm Bob Heskey.
Robert.
The host with the ghost.
This is my podcast based on my paranormal documentary, Afraid of Nothing. Each episode, we talk to people who see life and the afterlife through a different lens. Join me.
Who is this large man? And what's he doing in our bedroom?
As we lift the veil and open our minds to see beyond our eyes lie. This is Afraid of Nothing.
Paul Blake Smith, the other PBS. Welcome to the show, Paul. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me on. It's my pleasure.
Hey, so you grew up in Cape Girardeau, Missouri, and it's known for a couple things. One is a 1941 UFO crash outside of your hometown, but also there's a pretty famous guy that was an umpire when you were a kid. You want to tell us about that?
Well, he was known as Rusty Saw on the local airwaves. He was a radio DJ. His dad bought the radio station and kind of forced them to put his son on. But hey, anyway, you can get a job. But it didn't pay much. So he got a job as an umpire in the park of Little League games when I was a boy. And he was standing right behind me calling the balls and strikes. You know him as Rush Limbaugh, the famous broadcaster for several decades, who passed away sadly this year.
Now, did he ever give you any of those dramatic call strikes like, you're out? Did he ever do that? Or did you use?
Not really. Most of our umpires are pretty polite. They were all much bigger than me, including Rush. I was a skinny little kid. I was 10 years old at the time. And hey, who knew the guy was going to be rich and famous? But he is Cape Girardeau's most famous citizen. However, his grandfather lived to be 104. And he was the most respected, beloved figure until Rush, the broadcaster, came along. if you don't like getting too political, Rush, the grandfather, was just, he was like, he would be on the Mount Rushmore of Cape Girardeau before his grandson became famous.
One of the tragic umpire stories from, I was a horrible athlete in my life, I mean, in baseball too, right? But one of the things that happened in Little League, the uncle of a guy that was the coach's son on my Little League team, he hit a home run, but the umpire had called timeout. So he had to nullify it. And then the next pitch, he hit a weak grounder or something. And he was just screaming at his uncle. It was that awkward moment in Little League baseball, I remember from growing up.
I've never met Rush, I'll make clear, but a couple of different sources said that around 2006 or 7, Rush was doing his nationally syndicated radio show. And somebody called in and said, Rush, what's up with this UFO crash in your own hometown? And instead of dismissing the story and saying, well, that's just a bunch of nonsense, get off my show, he said, there's more to this story than you might think. And he moved on to the next caller. So that gave it even more credence. Rush's father was a big aviation buff who hung out at the airport in Cape Girardeau in the 1940s. And apparently the crash site happened not far from both airports. Actually, they were almost side by side, as weird as that sounds now. One of those airports is gone. It's been plowed under. It's a crop right now. But the other airport from the 40s is still there, Cape Girardeau Municipal Airport.
All right, so there's a military base out by there. So that kind of explains why, especially recently in the news, a lot of UFO activity is around military bases or things like that. So that's interesting. Tell us the story, the 1941 crash. I know it's on your website. You wrote a book about it. Why don't you tell us what the name of the book is and where they can get it, and then give us kind of the Reader's Digest version of it.
Very well, if you insist, sir. The book is called Mo 41, The Bombshell Before Roswell. I call it Mo 41 simply to emphasize right up front that this was not the 1947 New Mexico UFO crash. This was 1941 in Missouri, 6 years earlier. So there was a National Guard Armory training facility in Cape Girardeau in those days, and its most famous alumni, if you want to call it that, was Harry Truman, who as a young soldier in 1906 lived in Cape Girardeau, and in 1941 was in Washington, D.C. as a pretty influential U.S. senator. But in 1941, he was busy in Washington when an aerial crash happened. It was on a late April night, just after sunset, and it was so close to the airport that the person who owned the farm where the crash occurred called up the Cape Girardeau Fire Department and Police Department, and they shared the same building downtown Cape Girardeau in those days, and said there's been a plane crash. It must have missed the airport and crashed on my farm. There's a fireball and a fire. Can you please send somebody out here right away? So apparently, according to a key eyewitness, the police showed up, the Cape County Sheriff's Department showed up, the fire department showed up, probably some hospital personnel. The word went out. This is an emergency situation. Looks like an airplane has gone down just outside of Cape. And when the people got there, there was no cylindrical airplane with propellers or struts or engine exhaust, even wings. It was a circular craft, to much of everyone's surprise. And it was cracked open in the field, and people were examining it and saying, well, what in the world is this? It doesn't look like anything we've ever seen before. And someone had pulled out of the wreckage, apparently, 3 small, dead, gray aliens with big heads and big black eyes, long, thin arms and legs, crinkly skin, according to the key eyewitness, who was a Cape Girardeau pastor who had been called in. Now, you might say, well, why would you need a minister? But remember, people thought this was a plane crash, and there were going to be agonized victims and maybe even their families showing up, and they would need some amount of spiritual comfort. And Cape Girardeau was a very, very religious community, still somewhat the same, about 20,000 people in 1941. So a reverend was called at his home, and he said he was driven out by a police associate who took him about 12 or 13 miles outside of Cape to this farm, where there was indeed this fire that the fire department was fighting. Police and sheriff and a couple military men were on the scene, and an FBI agent. And I thought, well, that can't be right. Cape Girardeau didn't have an FBI office in those days, but when I researched it, I found they did indeed open one like March the 6th of 1941. So an FBI man would, of course, have been called, possibly thinking that it was sabotage. According to the articles I read, the FBI was worried about sabotage by pro-Nazi sympathizers in the Cape Girardeau area back in 1941, which sounds like an intriguing mystery right on its own.
Wow. Yeah.
So there was an FBI agent, and the minister said he saw all of this, and he knelt over the dead bodies and prayed for their souls. Pretty soon, some other outsiders came to the site with lights and metal machines, and everyone was kind of frightened and intimidated, but it wasn't aliens. It was the United States Army, or at least Air Corps. They were uniformed soldiers who hemmed in the site and said, put that debris down. You didn't see this. This never happened. It's a matter of national security. We'll take all your evidence, and you're not to talk of this. So Reverend Huffman, that was the name of the minister in Cape Girardeau, he did as he was told, and everyone clammed up. But when he went home that night, his family was very worried, like, where have you been? What's going on? So he told them the story. And his granddaughter went public with the story in a letter she sent to some UFO researchers. And people like Dr. Stanton Friedman and Ryan Wood came to Cape Girardeau and researched it. And I kept waiting and waiting around the year 2000. I thought, this sounds very, very exciting. I want to see a book on this. And I found out that, over the years, no one's writing a book. So I thought, well, I'll write one myself. And I did. And it came out in 2016. I did make one small mistake. I thought for sure that the accident happened on April the 12th. And I see now that I was mistaken, and I was able to reissue my book last November. I hope anyone who's interested in reading it will read the reissue that has the correction that April 12th is not the correct date. It's late April 1941. And a few new bits of information. In fact, something just came in the mail the other day, a source who said he thinks he knows where the crash occurred, somewhat close to a landmark that is familiar. I can't give the identity out over the air because I'm terribly afraid that half the world will descend on this poor person's farm and demand to see the evidence of the dead alien bodies or something like that, and I'll get sued. But you can understand that these are farms that can't be fenced in. It's lots and lots of cropland out there. And we can't have the public just showing up and traipsing all over the place and trampling crops and encountering the many rattlesnakes and copperheads that live out in the weeds in the farmland, trampling all over people's property, their home, their farm, their business. So it remains a bit mysterious to this day. And even if I knew the exact specific site, I don't think I would tell anyone.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. You mentioned it was a fire. I guess in my mind, I'm surprised that UFOs would burn. I would think that they would be made of something that would protect them from burning, going through the universe or hurtling through the galaxy or whatever. When was the first time that people started whispering about it again? Because it was all quiet. Then World War II hit. When did people start talking about it again, feeling comfortable that they could say stuff?
Apparently, most people did not talk about it. They kept hush. A few did talk about it. I spoke to a woman in my research who said I was a little girl around 11 years old at the time of the crash. And she said, I remember my parents and some other adults talking about these little men from space and their little spaceship. And she said, we didn't use the term ET or alien or UFO or anything like that. But she says, I distinctly remember this when I was a little girl outside of Cape on a farm. My own stepmother said she heard the story in the 1960s when she was going to Cape Girardeau High School. So this is certainly all before this letter that went public and got researched, investigated by some well-known UFO people around the year 2000. Linda Moulton Howe and Art Bell talked about it on the air, I think in 1999. It's something that was hushed at the time. And as you say, the war took over just some months later, and it really kind of obliterated the story. A number of people passed away, including the Cape Girardeau chief of police, who was probably at the scene. He died fighting in the Pacific. So it's tough, again, to get a firm grasp on this story. But according to the Huffman family narrative, a photographer was at the scene that night, probably for the local newspapers, and had taken a picture of one of these creatures being propped up. He was dead, but propped up and outstretched his arms. He took it with a small brownie camera and stuck it back in his pocket. And apparently he got away with this. He didn't tell the Army Air Corps that came in and demanded, you keep quiet about this, no evidence. He smuggled that camera out, developed the photograph, and showed up at the minister's house in Cape Girardeau. Then he said, I have a copy of this. I want you to have a copy, and handed over the picture. And the granddaughter of the very fine minister, a really good, trustworthy man, by the way, she said my family would get that picture out over the years when she was 10 or 11 years old in the early 1950s and show it around at family parties and whisper about it. She said, I got a good look at that picture, maybe close to a dozen times. And she said it was indeed this creepy looking alien with big black eyes and a big bulbous head, crinkly skin, almost like it was wearing a flight suit that crinkled, or its skin crinkled up in a reaction to our oxygen-rich atmosphere. She said a neighbor came by one day and said, let me have a look at that picture and I'll bring it back to you someday. And the guy disappeared within a week and never brought the photo back. So the evidence disappeared. However, I'd like to know about this photographer who said, I have a copy and I want you to have a copy. You would think he would make more than one copy for each other, that he would stash them away somewhere. I'd really like to see somebody come forward someday and say, you know, before I pass on, I'd like to get this story public now that UFOs and ETs are more mainstream after the Pentagon ruling and the 60 Minutes report we had within the past month or so.
Yeah, I guess you got to go to every estate sale in Cape Girardeau and hope you strike gold, you know?
Well, believe it or not, my father did go to an estate sale for the photographer that we suspect was in question. And he said, oh, if I'd only known the story, I really would have rooted through his photos. But I really can't imagine he left that out for the public to sort through and buy. What I think is he might have tucked some away in an attic under some insulation or in the basement behind a crawl space.
Yeah, right. When somebody demos a house, they'll find a picture someday, right? Yeah,
that's right. Or if you're going to renovate it, fix it up, get rid of an old hot water heater or something, maybe somebody will find it. But who knows? Maybe somebody has found it and they were quickly hushed by somebody somewhere. I don't want to get paranoid, but you never know.
So that's the seminal UFO episode in the United States. If that picture ever comes forward, that's the first one before Roswell, right?
Right. Boy, would that be worth a small fortune if it could be authenticated as an actual 1941 snapshot. Yeah. And, here's an alien, a real live. Apparently, it was like a dead doll almost. It was not mechanical. I always go by what Philip Corso said, the man who wrote The Day After Roswell. He said after much study by the military scientists, they concluded that the Roswell aliens discovered were biorobots that were probably kind of expendable, frankly. They could punch a few more out of a mold in a factory wherever they came from. They were like half organic and half robotic, and they were like servants to a higher intelligence, higher species, so to speak, of extraterrestrials. And that's could be an explanation why no one came back for the Roswell crash or the Cape Girardeau crash. No alien force came down and said, give us those bodies. We'll take that vehicle now. Apparently, there was no particular other sighting at the time.
Yeah, you know what I would do if I lived in Cape Girardeau? So I do a podcast where I interview shamans and psychics and mediums and ufologists and authors. I'd get like the town's medium and see if she could do a seance and call that photographer back and figure out where that thing is.
Yeah. The photographer we think is actually a far distant relative of mine in a roundabout way, but he passed on in the 1990s. And this is what made researching the case so difficult. Everyone's deceased, and in many cases, their children are deceased. So if they did talk, probably the story died out decades ago, one way or the other. So I did the best I could and pieced it together. There's some other clues, such as some documents that FDR apparently dictated to his secretary, sent out a couple memos mentioning these celestial devices, these wonders that have come to us. from outer space. He mentioned non-terrestrial science and technology committee he was forming. So these give you more and more clues that this is a very real story. It should have been the biggest bombshell in the whole world, certainly in the history of our country, but it got squashed pretty quick. People would ask, they often ask me in interviews, oh, yeah, well, how did the Army or the Air Corps show up so fast? They were there within an hour or two, right? How did that happen? Well, there was an Air Corps training program at an airport in Sikeston, Missouri, about 35, 40 miles south. And one of the leaders of that was the brother of the Cape Girardeau County Sheriff. All he had to do was place one quick call to his brother, and the brother would round up a crew, get in a truck, and bring them up to the site, which you could probably see from the smoke and the fire and the people gathered from any distant road. And he gave them directions, I'm sure. So that's how the military was able to take over this and hush it pretty quick. In 1941, when your military and your government told you to do something, you pretty much did it. There were no protesters back then.
Yeah, I mean, I give you credit. You don't take easy assignments. There's this one, and then also the book, your most recent book that we're going to talk about. It's been out for a while, a little bit, probably less than a year maybe, but President Eisenhower's Close Encounters. That one seems like it would be even harder to get information and research. So
that's right. Very high level stuff in which he was able to personally swear people to secrecy. And even that was, about 60 years ago or so, and more than that, I guess.
70, yeah, you're right.
Yeah, my math is not so good. But everyone's deceased from that, including Eisenhower, his wife, and his son. His granddaughter is very big on the story. And it was tough to research, too.
You wrote this book because, just like the first one, because you were dying to read the book and no one had written it, right?
That's right. And I thought, well, I did this with Cape Girardeau's story. I can do it with the Eisenhower one. And happily, it turned out well. I've been intrigued by the Eisenhower encounter story since the 1980s, when a source talked to a British lord who then talked to a reporter to the National Enquirer. And it became a big story in 1982. The Enquirer ran the Eisenhower encounter tale with this inside scoop from this eyewitness who was there. And it got picked up by some other newspapers and syndicated. And it really raised a lot of eyebrows. And I thought, wow, I can't wait to hear more about this. A U.S. president went to meet with some live aliens who were apparently very friendly and communicated in English. Can't wait for this. And of course, decade after decade went by. And I thought, I'll start piecing this together myself. And it turned out really well. That book is from foundationsbooks.net, and you can get it on Amazon, just like Mo 41, The Bombshell Before Roswell, which came out from Argus Publishing.
And you have a website, too, they can order from, right? Is it mo41.info, or what's your website?
That's correct. You are correct, sir.
Got one right. Excellent. So, yeah, I was going to say, what is your method to research a book? I'm going to ask you about the broad strokes of to set up the Eisenhower kind of encounter, but how do you even go about researching something like this?
Well, I've seen a lot of UFO books. I've read a lot. I've owned some. I get some from book sales. I go to the public library, a couple of different ones. Then I start going through what magazines or newspapers. You can go to a newspaper database online and read actual newspaper reports, if they've been saved, from the 1940s and 50s, and read the details of what was going on at that time. Little hints and clues can show up there. Another excellent source. Almost all U.S. presidents now have digitized their daily schedules, their appointment schedules from the Oval Office, including Eisenhower and before him Franklin Roosevelt in 1941. You can get exact details on who arrived at the Oval Office or where the president went. Unfortunately, they don't have records in those days of telephone calls. You kind of have to go with who showed up as logged in by the secretary. And a little word of caution, any secretary could take an order from the president and scrub something from the official record. For instance, Dwight Eisenhower meet with the head of the FBI and talk about UFOs for 3 hours, but that would have gone unrecorded. He would have instructed his secretary, don't write this down. You kind of do the best you can. And yes, there are UFO websites that you can go to also. Some of them don't always have the most accurate information, unfortunately.
Yeah, I would bet after the fact, after you've been on podcasts like you did with your first book, I'm guessing people may have reached out to you and said, hey, either they had a source of information or they pointed you somewhere. Did that happen with this book?
Just a little. I got to talk to a woman who was friends with a Palm Springs resident who was at the dinner President Eisenhower attended in February of 1954 that has led to a misunderstanding. It seems to be popular urban legend that Eisenhower pretended to have an injured tooth and went off to the dentist on a Saturday night in February of 54, leaving the Palm Springs compound where he was staying, and that he must have had his UFO encounter then. But I found out that story is not true. I mean, he really did have a dental emergency. He was biting on a leg of duck, and he bit into some buckshot, and he broke off a crown on a tooth, and he was really irritated and
Painful.
in pain, and they had to get him a dentist fast. And when they called the dentist, according to the source I spoke to, the dentist said, oh, yeah, right, the President of the United States needs me, and he hung up and went back to sleep that night. So that got Eisenhower even further grumpy, and it took quite a while. It was the night before when he snuck out Palm Springs and went to Edwards Air Force Base in a prearranged meeting and met with some landed extraterrestrials who were said to be very human-like, what I call the cousins of human beings, maybe from another planet very much like Earth, but with a bit of a different atmosphere, creating maybe a different nose or nostrils or larger chest for breathing a different atmosphere or less oxygen in the air or more. Otherwise, they were said to have looked quite a bit like humans.
So not grays, very sentient, very conscious type intelligent beings.
Right. About almost 5 foot tall at most, and not little gray aliens at all. Supposedly they had slightly fuzzy hair on their heads, not a lot of it, and that they were slightly misshapen compared to humans, according to this source who spoke to the British Lord, who then gave an interview to TV and to the National Enquirer. They knew an interesting story when they heard one. I know that's not always the most exciting source for news, but I contacted the author of that National Enquirer story, and he said, everything I wrote in there, I felt it was true. I stand by it to this day, and I have no retractions. I said, do you have any new information? He said, unfortunately, no. He stands by that original blockbuster story, and there have been all these bits and pieces of confirmation. Other sources, like a broadcaster named Frank Edwards, apparently did use his national broadcasting position in 1954 to tell at least some of the story as he heard it. He was wild about UFOs. Mr. Frank Edwards, kind of a legend in UFO and broadcasting circles. He was the Art Bell of his time. Oh. He talked about it on the air, and shortly thereafter, he was fired.
Yep, boy, that's, oh my God. It's
such a coincidence, huh?
Yeah, life is full of coincidences. Didn't he see a UFO before this encounter? Wasn't he on some naval ship or something at one point when he was a general? Right. If you don't mind, just that quick story, then we'll go back to this thing and how he talked to them and what we think went on.
Right. Remember that Eisenhower was a huge, popular figure in World War II when he organized the European war effort to destroy Hitler's Nazi forces. Came home to a ticker tape parade. And he became President Truman's Army Chief of Staff, and he served in a couple of other positions and probably knew all about Roswell. But in World War II, there were a lot of UFO sightings, and they called them Foo Fighters or fireballs in the sky. They didn't know what to make of this stuff. According to one source, a man who was a bodyguard to Winston Churchill, he was in the RAF, and he overheard Eisenhower and Churchill talking about this UFO sighting during the war, and said the two men discussed it and decided, let's keep this secret. We don't want to start a panic. We don't want people to lose their Christian faith or whatever religious faith that they have. We can't disrupt the war effort and let people know we're not in control of our skies. So after the war, around January of 1952, Eisenhower was on a mission for Truman to inspect our military readiness in Europe. It had been 7 years since the war, and the communists were making a lot of advances in Europe. Eisenhower went over and was touring the USS Franklin Roosevelt, which was, I believe, a carrier off the coast of France. And at one time, there was a storm that whipped up, and he went down below decks to try to sleep, and he just couldn't. The ship was probably rocking a good deal, even though it was a large ship. And he went up to the helm, and talked to the crew, the helmsman, in the middle of the night. This is like 2, 3 in the morning, I believe. And he asked for a cup of coffee. This is according to a man who wrote the story, and it was printed in the New York Post newspaper, I believe it was, New York News, New York Post, in 1997. The man said Eisenhower came up and spoke to us, and as we were all sitting around chatting during this terrible storm, we looked out and there was this circular spaceship hovering overhead. It just sat there in the sky, getting rained on. It wasn't buffeted by the wind. We all stood there and watched it for like at least 10 or 15 minutes. Eisenhower was not particularly ruffled. I kind of wondered, did anyone have the presence of mind to get a camera out and take a picture?
Yeah.
But during the thunder and lightning, they could see it very clearly. So after a while, it just zipped away. And Eisenhower told the crew, I'm going to look into this, but for now, you better keep it under your hat. And he said, we never heard back from him. Secrecy was the policy, and they followed it. And the man wrote this story in 97. Obviously, he didn't want the amazing tale to die out, that probably all the witnesses had passed away by then or were getting pretty old. And it was printed up as a very legitimate story. Eisenhower had the foundation laid for being very aware that we're being visited. And there's not much you can do about it, that there's at least a couple, 3, 4 different races. This is according to the Special Operations Army manual that was leaked some years ago. It was printed in April of 54 and gave a description of some of the aliens who were visiting us. It said that there have been crashes and recoveries, and this has been kept from the public because we don't want to start a panic. You can find it on the internet, or you can find it printed in a book by Ryan Wood called Magic Eyes Only. He's got it all printed up, and including all kinds of interesting UFO crash cases. I found that another good resource book for the things that I was writing about in the past few years.
So I want to share some reviews I've gotten from people. First, MB Hannah. She gave me a 5-star review and wrote, Loeb for President. That was based on our recent second interview with Avi Loeb, and she wrote, as usual, Heskey finds the most intriguing guest and uses his everyman style to get them comfortable in talking. Loeb is wicked smart, down to earth, and ready to lead the scientific world into a place of leadership by preaching research over war, innovation over condemnation, and active thinking over politics as usual. Love this podcast. And then Rob Fitz gave me a 5-star review, and he wrote, interesting listen. Love the subject matter, and it's really well presented. Hannah Faust wrote, perfect for road trips and commutes. I love the Afraid of Nothing podcast and look forward to each episode. Recently drove several hours and took Robert along for the ride. Solid content. Frank Grace wrote, fascinating. Robert covers a wide range of topics, and this podcast is an excellent companion to his documentary Afraid of Nothing. Then a person called A Substitute, probably not their name, wrote, interesting. Have heard Bob on Paranormal Podcast. I started listening. Little Frog sold it. Keep up the good work. And then Shelley Krupski wrote, excellent podcast. I recently discovered this podcast when the host was a guest on another podcast I listened to. I've been binging the episodes ever since. I am absolutely loving it. I listen to a wide variety of podcasts and have been checked out quite a few on the paranormal. This one is very well done. The guests are solid and interesting, and I've even taken notes from some episodes. I love how the podcast moves right along with consistent, interesting information. There's never a dull moment. I don't write reviews for every podcast I listen to, but I felt compelled with this one because I love it so much already. Thank you, everyone, for your kind, rock-solid 5-star reviews. Please do go to the website, www.afraidofnothingpodcast.com, and leave your review in the review section. And I'll give you a shout-out and read it out loud. And one side note. A couple weeks ago, I called the Westminster Historical Society on a rainy day. I asked one if they had any haunted ghost stories I could have in an upcoming podcast. They do, so look forward to that. And then I asked about my house that had a kind of an odd layout to it. And they said it was a tea house in the 1920s. I bring this up because it's interesting, and also a person I get Reiki from told me, if I mention the word tea several times on a podcast, then the ghosts or the spirits that have been at this house will help me raise my listenership. So there you go. Tea.
And now, believe it or not, I've got another book I've just finished yesterday, unless there's something new that happens, on the Richard Nixon, Jackie Gleason ET encounter at Homestead Air Force Base in February of 1973. And I bring this up as shameless self-promotion, but because it happened on the same exact date as the Eisenhower encounter at an Air Force base in California, February 19th. Both men went out at night to see something otherworldly. And I don't think it was a coincidence. According to a number of clues and sources, one in a document that got leaked a few years ago, Eisenhower really did form a treaty with these friendly human aliens and asked them to please stay away in general. Don't show yourselves. Don't start a panic. And I believe the document says presidents since that time have adhered to that document, to that agreement. And that's why we don't have UFO landings at the White House or over a ball game, at a stadium or something like that. They've agreed not to disrupt our society. In exchange, they do land at a remote Nevada air base, according to this document, and communicate with our scientists, military people there, where nobody can get even close for probably 100 miles in all directions.
Wow.
That's an interesting document, and it's also on the internet called, if you look up Ultra Top Secret, that's one of the names of this 1989, January 1989 briefing for the new Bush administration. And I believe it is a valid document, and I have it reprinted largely in the back of my Eisenhower book.
And people forget it's well-founded that Churchill and Eisenhower would be cautious about mass hysteria because War of the Worlds was like in 1938, right? And that was just a drama play, and people almost went crazy going out in the street with guns, and all this madness ensued. So that was probably fresh on their minds as well, do you think?
Absolutely. Whether that idea that a panic really happened or was overblown by Orson Welles bragging, either way, it was the perception that people would panic and that they would grab their guns and go rushing out. Supposedly, a couple of people had heart attacks when they heard this radio broadcast, War of the Worlds. So even though they were told repeatedly, this is just a stage play we're putting on for you, folks, it's not real, they didn't pay attention. So it was probably a really big factor for the military to say this was what could happen. And they kept the 1941 UFO crash secret because of that, and the 54 encounter Eisenhower with these human-like aliens and other events. It's so frustrating. We'd all like to know the truth now, especially on things that happened 50, 60, 70, 80 years ago, because there's no one left alive that would be offended if their name was released in a document. We're not revealing sources and methods that could be subject to recrimination. Everyone's frankly dead. So why not release that information? Do they really think we're going to run into the streets and have heart attacks if we were to be allowed to read some of this stuff, the actual government files?
Yeah, no, with all the distraction now, we'd probably be worried about something stupid like what's on Netflix. But is it true that I think there were like five UFOs that came and that the military fired on them at first? Is that true?
That's a story that I uncovered. I wish I had more facts on this. When Eisenhower was playing golf on his golf vacation in Palm Springs, 2,700 miles from Washington, he sure went a long way to play golf. Yeah. That was the pretext, the cover story. He knew that it was very possible that the friendly aliens would land at the prearranged site, Edwards Air Force Base. But when they came down, a military sergeant said that a general ordered us at artillery practice to open fire on them. I mean, we did, as we were told. And the artillery shells had no effect on the 5 ships as they came down out of the sky. 3 were circular, 2 were elongated. They landed quite peacefully at the base in front of a hangar on a runway. They were amazed that all of their finest artillery had no effect at all on the alien technology that landed. So out of the ships came these friendly alien human types, or humanoids, I guess you could call them. And they spoke with some Air Force officials, base officials who came out to greet them, probably scared out of their wits, but they could see that
we were only kidding.
Yeah, right, the humanoids were generally were expected, and they were unarmed and offered right away, would you like to go aboard our ship and see how they run and see that we are unarmed and we mean you no harm? I'm not sure if anyone took them up on that offer, but people ask, and I'm sure it's going through your mind right now, well, how could this be set up in advance? How was this prearranged? It's a little shaky, I'll admit, but supposedly I've read in a number of UFO books and sources that there was an ongoing government communication program using high-frequency radio waves. We made contact with a race, probably using binary code. It was felt that they were friendly enough and they were trusted. And that's why Eisenhower was not there directly when they landed, in case they were not so friendly. He was playing golf in Palm Springs, about 90 miles away from Edwards Air Force Base. And when he was given the go-ahead by telephone from the Air Force Base officials, he hopped a plane and flew out there. You can bet that if there was the slightest bit of hostility or uncertainty by Air Force officials, Eisenhower probably would have been hustled out of Palm Springs pretty quick, he and his wife, and gotten back to Washington or a secret location. He was not a cowardly man, not by any means. You can't be an Army hero and be a coward. On the contrary, Eisenhower decided to go for this and went out and met with these alien ambassadors who were probably quite intelligent, probably what we would call biologists, astronauts, zoologists, botanists, people who are curious about our planet and what we're doing to it with pollution, and the threat of nuclear weapons was apparently a subject they discussed.
Boy, I mean, Eisenhower was very religious too. I bet you in a private conversation, I wonder if you've ever asked anything about religion or if they worship anyone. That would be interesting to hear.
It sure would. Eisenhower, by the way, was the first U.S. president to be baptized in office. He was already a Christian, but he wanted to reconfirm his faith within a month of his taking office. In early 1953, he was baptized, and he insisted that our currency reflect the term "In God We Trust." That was his doing, and that when he was in office 1 year, he took office January 1953. He set up the Eisenhower ET encounter at Edwards for February of 1954 and pulled it off and managed to do so in great secrecy, although some military people leaked the story, and that's how Frank Edwards, the broadcaster, got it. It also appeared in a October 1954 issue of Valor magazine. Desmond Leslie was a British author who was touring America, and he went to an Air Force base, and they said, "Have you heard this thing about Eisenhower over at Edwards?" So he went to Edwards and he interviewed some people. It was just so fantastical. You know, people probably didn't believe it back then. That, oh, come on, a president went to meet with aliens. Sure. It does seem a little far-fetched at the outset. But the more I researched it and crammed in as many facts and sources as I could in my book, I'm convinced it did happen. And from all of the reviews I read on Amazon, lots of people are now catching on that, yeah, this really did happen. It's awesome.
Now, looking back at President Eisenhower after doing this research, is he one of your favorite presidents? Do you think he handled this right? How do you feel about him?
I think he handled it pretty well. I'm disappointed that in the years leading up to his death, he knew he was ill, that he didn't tell anyone. Like a good soldier, he kept quiet. This was his order in 1954, and he stuck to it. In the military, you learn loose lips sink ships, so you don't talk. And he did not. I wish he had signed a confession or made a little short film to be released after his death. But apparently he did not. Or if he did, it was squashed by someone, his lawyer or his family. But the interesting part is in the early 1980s, an Air Force test pilot who was a young member of the Edwards Air Force Base personnel said, "I was called in to this meeting to give my expert opinion on the aerodynamics of the alien technology. And I was standing right nearby when Eisenhower met with these creatures, these human-like extraterrestrials. And he said they were very friendly and peaceful, but Eisenhower made sure to keep himself surrounded by a special bodyguard contingent of about 6 people, 6 men. The pilot said, as an older man speaking up in the early 80s, he's telling the story now because he's learned everyone else had died, and he didn't want the story to die. So he said that Ike spoke in English and the aliens spoke in English. They obviously were familiar with our government and our customs, and they knew who to go to for sure. And I just kind of wonder if who landed in 1954 were monitoring Eisenhower and were even the same race of creatures that hovered over his battleship in 1952 just before he made the decision to run for president. Eisenhower was on the fence in 52, but as of mid-February of that year, he decided to go for it and throw his hat in the ring, and he won overwhelmingly. He was so amazingly popular.
How long did the aliens stay for? Was it just a quick flyby, or did they stay for a couple of days?
According to the test pilot, the aliens landed, spoke to Ike for a while, and then they put on 2 shows that really razzle-dazzled everybody. First, they got in their ships and they decided to put on an air show and say, this is what our technology can do. And they went up in the sky and buzzed around and probably amazed everyone with gravity-defying aircraft that could turn on a dime in midair and go at speeds far exceeding our jet craft. And then they came down and landed silently, and they all got out, none the worse for wear. And it was what happened next that convinced Eisenhower, you guys are going to have to go. And they did after that display. Apparently, they got in their craft and took off that night. Do you know what it is that they did? Should I tell you?
Yes, you should. I won't tell anybody. Go ahead.
We won't tell anyone, but I'll just tell Bob Heskey that the aliens put on a display of invisibility as if they could cloak themselves right in front of them. The test pilot said, we can tell that they were there, but they went invisible to our naked eyes. We couldn't see them, but we knew they were there. And this really rattled Eisenhower. And he said, we can't have this. Our people are not ready for this. This would cause a panic if you came down and did this kind of stuff or taught it to other people. You know, nowadays we're really getting into cloaking and invisibility and, camouflaging ships and people in our military. I'm not an expert, but I have read a little about this. So it may have seemed far-fetched in 54, but now it's becoming more and more a reality to disguise your presence. And these were obviously advanced, intelligent, peaceful aliens. Sure wish they would come back and help us out now.
Now, did they come back a year later and did Eisenhower sign a treaty a year later, or did he sign a treaty that first time?
That's claimed in the 1989 briefing document for the new incoming Bush administration that in 54 or 55, they came back and landed at, I think, Kirtland Air Force Base was it Holloman? I get those two mixed up, in New Mexico. And the late, great Art Campbell was a UFO researcher who did a terrific job uncovering this story before that government document was ever leaked in 2017. Art put together some eyewitness accounts that said Eisenhower arrived on his Air Force One plane called the Columbine. And after he was sitting on the runway for a while, these 2 circular discs came down out of the sky. One remained hovering in midair, and the other landed peacefully on little tripod legs. A doorway opened up, a ramp, and that supposedly a person got out, quite possibly Eisenhower himself, from the Air Force jet, walked over and got into the UFO, as we would call it, the disc, and after a few minutes came back out and walked back to his airplane. The 2 alien craft took off. And this might have been, if we can speculate, the conclusion of this agreement that both sides got other people to sign on to this, that we were not going to interfere with their visiting here as long as they did it at this remote Nevada air base. And they would exchange some materials, alien materials, for any human materials that they requested. That was part of the agreement, sort of a swap of goods. And that might have been part of the 55 encounter also. In exchange for that, the extraterrestrials agreed not to land and show themselves and put on a big display. Don't start a panic anywhere. And I kind of wonder to this day, do you think that would happen if the aliens did land and step out and, like in the day the Earth stood still, land on the National Mall and and try to talk to people? What would be the reaction in 2021?
It's kind of mind-boggling. Hey, it seems like that treaty must have ended because now they're buzzing, theoretically, according to the Pentagon report. I mean, they're buzzing military exercises, military bases, kind of showing off again. So I think you mentioned in your book that you believe, or there's some evidence that could allude to the treaty being updated every 5 or 10 years with presidents after the fact.
I believe that may have been why Nixon was visiting Homestead Air Force Base, because he had to do this on that exact date, February 19th. That's my theory. And he figured Jackie Gleason wants to know all about aliens. I'll cut him a break. And he showed him a little something that was there at the base. But also, let's go back to Lyndon Johnson. He was president after 10 years. And what happened? Mid-February of 1964, he flew all the way to Palm Springs and met with Dwight Eisenhower for a couple of days, like the 19th, 20th, 21st. And there's some gaps in his printed, digitized schedule. And it's like, what in the world? Of all the places he could go on the 10th anniversary of what would have been the Eisenhower encounter and this agreement that may have been reached that night, President Johnson also flew back and met with Eisenhower on the 15th anniversary. What a coincidence, on February 19th in Palm Springs, 1968. 69, I think it was. So we have those specific dates, and you got to start asking yourself, what in the world is going on? It just can't be a coincidence that they're all getting together on the 19th of February. Also checking Nixon's schedule for the following year, 74, the 20th anniversary. And amazingly, that's been scrubbed from his records. Like the 19th, they've taken out everything. Not just a few appointments, but you're not allowed. It says removed from files. So I'm thinking, bingo, he was in Florida at the time, just like the year before when he was with Jackie Gleason at Homestead. So that's part of my new book. I hope they have that out by the end of the year. And it will be kind of a companion piece to the Eisenhower encounter book.
There's one story, which I know you're not you don't take much credence in, but I'll throw it out anyways, because I've heard it a couple different places. In 1957, there was supposed to be an extraterrestrial named Valiant Thor, very human-looking, very kind of almost all-American type of looking guy, allegedly landed outside of Washington, D.C. in a craft with a couple other people. Same thing, fired upon, demanded to speak with President Eisenhower, and then evidently for the next 3 years, he lived inside the Pentagon working with scientists and government officials. There have been several books written on that. I think the most famous one is by Frank E. Strangers. It's called The Stranger at the Pentagon. Did you come across that or have any research or evidence on that? Because there are pictures of this guy, Valiant Thor.
You Google this on the internet and you get a picture of some guy. Then you get a picture of a different guy. Then you get another picture of a different guy. And they gave specific dates where this event allegedly occurred. So I looked him up. It said that the story is that he landed in a field in Virginia and was taken to the president within 24 hours on a specific date. So I looked it up. Eisenhower wasn't even in the country. He was in the Caribbean on a military tour. He wasn't even in Washington. Also, I'm very skeptical of the Valiant Thor story. Where are any documents to support this or any eyewitness accounts that have come forward? I remain skeptical. I guess it could have happened. But I need to see some proof, and the dates that they gave just don't match up.
It's almost a different take of the 1954, because there were 5 ships then, and they were very human-like, and they were shot upon, and then they demanded to meet with the president. So it's almost like the TV version of the 1954 incident, isn't it?
Kinda, and I'm proud to say that my book is going to be hopefully turned into a TV show. I've got a deal with a production company, and they're looking into it right now. They've got a year to do something or pass, and we're hopeful that we'll get something on like History or Discovery Channel. There's so many people interested in these things now, more and more people getting open-minded. I'd just like to track back to that 60 Minutes interview real quick.
Sure.
Did you hear the military officer say that not only did we see this tic-tac and strange things we can't explain, but we hear from other military personnel and pilots and such, they see this every single day.
Yep.
He said this. It's like, what? I mean, they're not only admitting that occasionally, but every day this is going on. So you're right. They are, aliens might be stepping up and observation, monitoring us, but also we've got technology that perceives them, more people in the air that can see them. It does seem like things are changing, doesn't it?
Yeah, and they're certainly not doing the cloaking, being invisible doing it. They're being in full sight. So Eisenhower and the ET Summit, is there any connection to that, to the Steven Spielberg movie, Close Encounters of the Third Kind? Was there any inspiration there, do you think? Or
I found that Dr. Alan Hynek of Project Blue Book was familiar with the Eisenhower story. He died in 1984. But before he passed, he was a personal guide or mentor to Steven Spielberg and provided information for his movie, Close Encounters of the Third Kind. And what was it? It was an Air Force base out in the desert, no one around, just like the 54 encounter. And aliens came down and landed, and they spoke, they communicated in some manner to the Air Force officials and people there. I've got to believe that Spielberg learned about the story of Eisenhower from someone, probably Dr. J. Allen Hynek. Tough because Mr. Spielberg does not really do interviews and talk about these sorts of things. I got a contact who had a contact of Steven Spielberg to offer the Eisenhower story to them as a new movie. And I'm told that Spielberg said, sorry, I'm kind of out of the extraterrestrial business. I've done enough of those. I kind of wonder, could he change his mind now that it's back more mainstream and being talked about more? And maybe he would be fascinated by a real life tale that he could tell without obscuring it in a sort of fictional storyline as he did in E.T. and Close Encounters. But we'll see.
yeah, definitely something to be continued. It's interesting. It's happening in 2021 and kind of after the year of 2020. Well, I guess they've been happening for a couple of years. So, man, the timing is weird. I always thought like it would be in my lifetime. Our lives go by so quick. Am I going to witness something that nobody has seen before? And I could be in luck. So I'm going to hang in there for a while.
I agree. I've never seen a UFO myself. And I'm always hopeful that someone will tap into a computer file and just expose all sorts of great juicy secrets. But that just never seems to really happen, except for that Skinny Bob video. You know, that was supposed to be a Russian KGB file that maybe like the United Nations or something like that had it, and that got hacked.
Really? One of my guests a couple episodes ago, his name's Avi Loeb. He's a Harvard astrophysicist. He did a book a couple years ago. He actually was out about a year ago, Extraterrestrial, the First Intelligent Sign of Life on Earth. I may be butchering the title. But he came back to talk about the Pentagon report, his thoughts on it. And he was very much talking about building private funded, having science rather than politicians and the government or the military monitor the sky, have science do that and get very like a network of high-powered cameras and get an image, capture an image. Because he had said, you know, in the show, he said, you'll know if it's made in China or made in Mars or whatever. You'll see like the label on the ship, you know. So.
I say good luck to that, because I don't think the military and the government are going to take the lid off that can of worms. I don't think they'd allow them to do that. But who knows, maybe someone like Bezos or Branson or some of these billionaires, Elon Musk, who go against the grain and kind of do whatever they want in space, maybe they'll put together something like that.
Well, right now they can't stop you from filming the skies, you know. Just like you can't, you know, so it's pretty hard to stop. I mean, that was his take on it. So yeah, it's interesting. Before we go, let's do a tease. You have another book you're working on about the untimely death of Marilyn Monroe, and maybe without spilling the beans too much, I mean, some of the conspiracy theories you hear is that she, of course, had an affair with both JFK and his brother Robert. They would tell her things, and maybe she kind of was going to go public with that. Any thoughts or any teaser you would have about that book for our audience?
I had it in there, and I kind of took it out, and I might put it back in, that Marilyn did say to a couple of friends that Robert Kennedy told her that JFK had gone to an Air Force base out west and seen some extraterrestrial bodies and materials. And she described it to a man named Robert, what's his last name? We'll just call him Bob. And Bob gave an interview in the 1990s and said, Marilyn personally told me about what Bobby Kennedy told her. And he said that the aliens were your typical grays with big bulbous heads and big black eyes, that they'd been recovered from a crash out west somewhere, and that we had the evidence. And Marilyn was threatening to give a press conference and, quote, blow the lid off this whole damn thing. And that might have been part of it. You never know. She might have kept that to herself, but she had other juicy dirt. She wanted revenge on all the people who had been using her. And she felt that the Kennedys were among that list, including her psychiatrist. and that mafia influences had a great deal of pressure on the American government for what they knew in an attempt to kill Castro. That was shocking. And in its day, Maryland knew too much and was willing to talk too much, and something had to be done. And unfortunately, it was. Next year will be the 60th anniversary. I hope I can get a book out in time to take advantage of that renewed interest in her very mysterious and untimely demise.
All right, well, I'm going to have to let you go back to work and start wrapping that up then. Paul, thank you so much. Great job on the book. You want to give us one more plug? The book is called President Eisenhower's Close Encounters, where people can purchase it. Is it available as an Audible book too?
I don't believe it's an audio book, but you can get all kinds of ebook forms, and they're very, very affordable from foundationsbooks.net. You can go to amazon.com. And for Mo 41, the Bombshell Before Roswell on the Cape Girardeau story, you can also get lots of different ebook and Kindle forms of that, very affordable, from aargusbooks.com or again, Amazon. Try to get the 2020 reissue of that edition. I'm really pleased with the way that turned out, and I'd like to get another TV deal for that. I just have the toughest time getting production companies interested in Cape Girardeau. They all seem obsessed with Roswell.
Boy, but that's the angle that it's the one before. Hire a psychic medium and see if they tell you something. Maybe they'll bring it to a house and you can tear down a wall and find it. So,
well, I want to find some hard proof, like the twisted metal left in the ground. Supposedly, a Cape Girardeau farmer found some of the metal when he bought the farm, not figuratively, but he literally bought the farm from the couple who owned it in 41 and was digging in the dirt and found pieces of metal he could not cut or bend and had strange hieroglyphic type symbols on them, and he hid it. I wish he would come forward with that, or give it to me and I'll come forward with that. But then again, you might hear that I've met with a sudden heart attack, and we can't have that.
No. Well, maybe they'll listen to this podcast. It'll give them the guts to come out. So that'd be great.
Hopefully.
So, Paul, thank you so much for your time. Great job. And thank you for doing the hard work and writing about stuff that no one does, and being curious and just an avid, tenacious researcher to get these books done. I look forward to your next book and look forward to hearing you more in podcasts. You're also a great guest on several podcasts I've heard as well, too. So keep up the good work.
Mucho apreciado. Maybe we'll be on again someday. Thank you for having me on today.
You bet.
You've been listening to the Afraid of Nothing podcast. Please subscribe and like us on Facebook. Until next time, stay scared.
Hey, you're still here? Great. Then why not listen to another episode? Visit AfraidOfNothingPodcast.com to peruse all the shows. That's AfraidOfNothingPodcast.com. And while you're there, click the coffee cup icon to buy me a coffee and leave a review. I'll give you a shout-out in an upcoming episode, and the world will know how swell you are.